to let you know that we have interpretation into Bahasa Indonesia, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Please click on the globe icon at the lower part of the Zoom window to select your language. I'm Nathania Jacobs. I'm a senior researcher in the Law, Economies and Justice team at the International Institute for Environment and Development, otherwise known as IID, and I welcome you all to this webinar on collective land and the just transition. This is the 7th webinar in the series on advancing land-based investment governance, or the ALIGN project, and it focuses on strengthening the governance of land-based investments in the Global South. The series explores common challenges surrounding investments and the practical strategies being deployed to address them. The global transition from fossil fuels to low-carbon economies is not only urgent, but it must also be just. A just transition means more than just shifting energy systems. It requires ensuring that climate solutions are socially legitimate and grounded in rights-based approaches. Elements of distributive justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice must all be met. Many of the proposed mitigation and adaptation measures, from renewable energy projects to reforestation and ecosystem conservation, have significant land footprints and often overlap with collectively held lands. This raises critical questions about how collective land rights are recognized, protected, and integrated into planning for sustainable futures. It also asks us to reflect on how pressures from the transition are exposing new conflicts over ownership, consent, and control of collective lands. Today's webinar will explore these intersections, examining the challenges and opportunities of including collective lands in just transition strategies and highlighting lessons from diverse contexts. We'll aim to delve below the surface of the term collective lands and try to unpack some of the complexities around shared and specific rights, representation, and who gets to speak on behalf of communities. A quick logistical note. Participants will be off camera and on mute, but please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We currently have 140 participants in this webinar from all over the world. I see you all sort of introducing yourselves already, and you're clearly working in many different sectors. It would be good for us to get a feel of who is here today, so please do write your name and the organization and location in the chat. And also, a slight extra step is please indicate a number of how closely you're connected to this issue of collective lands and energy projects, namely 1 for directly affected or involved, 2 for indirectly affected and involved, and 3 for general interest or academic or as a journalist. We'll pop those instructions into the chat as well. Further note, this webinar is being streamed live on multiple platforms. If you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick out as many as possible for answering later in the webinar. Please also try to make your questions concise, not exceeding 2 sentences if possible. And finally, in the interests of transparency, I should add that today's session is being recorded, and you will receive the link to the video after this event. Also, an article with key messages will be available later on the Land Portal website. So now, without sort of further logistical notes, let me introduce our wonderful panel of speakers. We'll be getting perspectives from 3 different countries, as well as a global view on the growing transition-linked pressures. Firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Johanna von Braun, lead on people, climate, and nature at the International Land Coalition, where she also serves as the focal point for Indigenous peoples member organizations, with over 20 years of experience at the intersection of environment and human rights, including as co-founder and first executive director of Natural Justice. Johanna brings deep expertise on climate, rights, and land to today's discussion. I'm also pleased to have Jimmy Ochum joining us today. He is a land rights lead at Oxfam Uganda, where he supports Oxfam's global advocacy on land rights, food security and climate justice, an environmental human rights lawyer with deep expertise in land policy and conflict management and political economy of land governance in Africa. Jimmy brings extensive experience from his work with civil society, academia, and government. Joining us from South Africa is Wilmien Whitcomb, who is lead of the land program at the Legal Resources Center, where her work focuses on land reform, African customary law, and community governance systems. She's been deeply engaged in policy and law reform to strengthen the rights of rural and customary communities, and it has a particular emphasis on democratization, free, prior, and informed consent, and women's rights. Also joining us from South Africa is Siabo Manona. He's the Director of Land Governance Policy and Implementation, Pulitsane in South Africa. He's a leading specialist in land governance with over 30 years of experience across NGOs, the private sector, and academia. He's now working on supporting local municipalities to navigate their way through the maze of old order and new order statutes. And he's made significant contributions to research and policy formulation, particularly in land administration, land law, and rural development. And last but not least, we have Imam Hanafi, who's joining us from Indonesia. Iman's the national coordinator of JKPP, which is the Indonesian Community Mapping Network, translated into English. Iman is based in Bogor and has been active in the NGO sector since 1998. As a community organizer, Iman has used participatory mapping methods extensively and has expertise in community organization, facilitation, and training. His technical skills on participatory mapping are well recognized. He's contributed to several publications on the topic. So welcome everyone, and I feel especially privileged to have such a fantastic panel of speakers joining us today. And I want to jump straight into the first section, which is going to be presented by Johanna, and it's looking at what the pressures are. So Johanna, welcome, and I want to kick off the conversation with you. Could you describe some of the more recent developments around climate change and the just transition that are happening at the international level and that we're then seeing shaping the growing attention to collective land rights at the national level? Johanna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathania, and thank you for having us here at this event. I work, as Nathania said, for the International Land Coalition. We are a global network of over 300 organizations. Half of our members are grassroots or constituency-based organizations, and the others are a mix of civil society organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and others. What brings us together is that we believe in people-centered land governance, or to put it differently, that those who live on the land should be involved, and if not the decision maker on what happens to the land. So the reason we're working in this space is because, like probably most here on the call, we recognize the urgent need to decarbonize the global energy system, but we are concerned about the very land-intensive nature of the green energy production, or the transition to green energy, particularly into territories that's customarily held by indigenous peoples and other local communities. So I'm going to speak here about some of the pressures that we see emerging, and hope this sets the scene for the rest of the conversation. Let's go to the next slide, please. But first, I want to put things into perspective. We all know the world is getting warmer and continues to getting warmer. And in spite of the increasing conversations of energy transitions, fossil fuels continue to be and constitute the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions, especially when it comes to methane and CO2, and continues to be the single biggest driver of global warming. After that, we see agriculture as the second most important driver, but fossil fuels continue to be the biggest driver. So there's no question that phasing out of fossil fuel continues to be the most effective solution to reducing climate change. Next slide, please. With that in mind, we do see a considerable increase in the generation of what's called, obviously, green energy or renewable energy. We see a rapid growth in consumption. And here you see a slide of the EIA, the US Energy Information Administration, that are projecting a significant growth. However, we can also see that fossil fuels at this point are not going down. In fact, they're also still increasing. So I want to just put this into perspective, because we talk about energy transition a lot, but in fact, up to date, it's not an energy transition at all. It's rather in addition. So where the increasing demand for energy is being met by mostly renewables, that does not mean at this point we are transitioning out of fossil fuels. And I think this is important in mind, because like many other green initiatives, there is a labeling issue that communicates a story that's not necessarily the case. And with that comes significant investment. So between 2015 and 2023, we see annual investment of $1.2 trillion in clean energy, which is projected to increase. And if we are to achieve net zero, we will have to see a $3 to $5 trillion investment into clean energy investments generation every year. To the next slide, please. Now let's have a look at the type of energy production that is meeting the additional energy demand. The lion's share continues to be on hydropower, but this is clearly decreasing now, and we see a rapid uptake in solar and wind energy. So if you look at this, the figures here, the US uses approximately 4,000 terawatt hours per year. So at this point, without hydropower, this is something that can be met by clean energy. With hydropower, you can approximately double that, triple that, I guess. Next slide, please. The energy transition is in turn driven by both political and economic forces. From the political side, we see significant global commitment towards for shifting away from fossil fuels. At COP28, parties agreed to the transitioning away from fossil fuels, as well as to triple renewable energy production by 2030, which is in turn supported by a very strong climate movement that zooms in on ending the fossil fuel era. And economically, we now also know that 90% of new renewable projects are actually cheaper than fossil fuels, sometimes quite significantly cheaper, about 50% cheaper. So with China continuing being the strongest driver in this, at this point, investing 10% of its GDP into renewables. So these are massive forces that are going into space. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now we're here today because we started recognizing that we have this need for clean energy generation. We cannot ignore that there's a number of critical externalities that are related to it. There's hidden costs and blind spots that are quite significant. Green energy production is estimated to be 10 times as land intensive as fossil fuels. Mostly this is because it is very mineral intensive, driving a growing demand for minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and others. And we will discuss later the location of these minerals. And if you look at these spider, I think they're called spider graphs of UNEP, you can see that all of the different types of green energy productions are quite significant in materials, with 3 of the 4 also being very intensive of just sheer land occupation. So these are the concerns related to it. And so I was looking for something like some figures that could make it more so good to compare. So if you look at an electric car, the estimate is that it requires 6 times more minerals than a normal car, and an offshore wind farm needs about 9 times more minerals per megawatt than a gas plant. So just to keep this in mind, like in terms of material and land impact, it's quite significant. Responding to this demand, we see a critical surge in mineral production and their estimates. This is a slide that looks at the estimates until 2050. And you can see the increase that we are anticipating here, with some of them going up, like lithium 12-fold, expected to go 12-fold, with the lion's share of these in the light blue one. If you look at this, the demands by energy transition, and the other ones are sort of used for phones or other materials, like for lithium in particular. But you see a significant increase in these demands to be expected, with the market expected to reach $77 billion by 2040, which is doubling what we have seen last year. Again, mostly this is electric cars, just to keep that in mind. Electric car sales are going up. and there is a 35% increase per year, and we believe this, or the literature believes this to be the biggest driver of particularly lithium, but also a number of other critical minerals. Next slide, please. So the reason we are in this is because there's now increasing concern about the location of these minerals. The main study that is being used is by somebody called John Owen, who published a paper in 22 that looks at the location of the minerals that are required for the energy transition, and estimates that over half of them are either in or near indigenous peoples and other collective communities' lands and territories. In some cases, this is as high as 70%. And as we know, indigenous peoples in particular hold a small share, about 5% of the global population, but are estimated to control up to 25% if you include other communities, traditional communities and local communities. The estimate is about half of the world. But we also know that only about 11% or so are formally recognized. So particularly where land rights are insecure, the indigenous peoples and communities are poised to really experience the most immediate impact of the increasing demands for mineral, especially in areas where the land rights are not secure. We know from a history of colonialism that mining has been one of the biggest driver of conflict and environmental injustices. And so with this significant increase in demand, we are likely to see an increase of conflict emerging on these lands. In this next slide, we see, oops, one more. Sorry, one more, that one, thank you. In this, here you can see the share of the individual resources that are prone to overlap with indigenous peoples and other communities, lands and territories, as well as regional hotspots. He underlines in his paper the considerable pressure, and particularly in Latin America and Asia Pacific, for indigenous peoples, and in Africa, particularly a high amount of project located in local community and rural lands. That is, and land and also areas that are characterized as being inhabited by both indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, please. So with such a significant economic and political drive towards these minerals, there's a number of risks, of course, that are on the horizon. There are immediate concerns for land infringements, particularly where land rights are not secured. There's concerns for displacement of communities, but there's also a landscape level impact in terms of where, for example, water resources are quite significant. So, for example, for lithium mining, for every ton of lithium, you need 2 million liters of water. So it is draining water resources in areas that are often already quite dry. So you need about 1 ton of lithium to produce 70 Tesla cars. So for that, you need 2 million liters of water. So these are significant impacts in terms of on the landscape level that often are not reflected when we look at just the location of these mines. We did some research in-house. Next slide, please. On the land conflicts that are related to this. We went going through a database that looks at the cause of conflict, and my colleague identified a growing amount of land conflict, up to 8,000 per year. If you look at the orange, he identified those related to energy transition minerals. So this data as well is backed up by an increasing amount of defenders that are being affected, land and environmental defenders that are being effective, where we know that 30% of the attacks, this is coming from the Allied database, are directly against indigenous peoples, of which 75% in turn are driven by mining activity. And again, with the increased demand on some of these minerals, these are likely to increase. Very quickly, I think I'm coming to my time's ending up. One little point is that we don't know very much about the data. We need better data. We know that only about half of what's visible geospatially is actually accounted for in public databases on in terms of the mines and their location and landscape impact. So we need better data in order to really have a better sense of what's coming, and also where we currently already see quite a lot of impact. In terms of way forward, I think it's good that there's an increasing recognition that this is an issue. We cannot talk about energy transition without recognizing the hidden cost. There's a number of initiatives also led by indigenous peoples and others. There was a Geneva summit. There's a number of other events in and around the Permanent Forum. There's been a number of reports by the Secretary General. There's been the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights report. There was a World Bank Land Conference last year put in the opening panel, already putting awareness on this issue. So it's becoming noticeable to the extent that even mining associations are revising the standards, but it's clearly not enough. We need obviously a recognition of indigenous peoples and other community land rights and rights to the resources, and a clarity that in spite of the energy crisis, these are not negotiable. With this, obviously, the call for the implementation of the United Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other related rights, particularly in areas where we know that land insecurity persists and they overlap with a lot of these minerals and land demands. Indigenous peoples and other communities are rights holders, not stakeholders. With voluntary standards, obviously not enough, and there is a critical need to examine the landscape level impact of some of the point data that is available for mining, especially. We also know that the need to look at the systems level, sustainable consumption and production boundaries. In the beginning, it was clear that we have an increase in demand that's being met by green energy production, but that in itself is not actually looking at how can we consume less. There are questions of equity and distributive justice, as was mentioned in here, that are critical. There was an SDG that used to look at this issue, and somehow nobody talks about this SDG anymore. And discuss energy justice also from that perspective. And then finally, I think one of the things that's also critical is that we need to align with the environmental movement, where it was about coal. Everybody's against coal. It's very easy when it comes to lithium. It's more complicated, and it's really important that we don't find a end fossil fuel movement rallying against a human rights movement that is going to be affected by this. So I'm going to end with this. Thank you. I hope this helps to set the scene.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and you've done an excellent job at covering what is a vast landscape of knowledge in the very short time that we allocated to you. I think, as you put it, there's that massive momentum towards exploiting natural resources, whether they're the ground that they're on or what's under the ground. And I think you also raised some important issues and questions in setting that scene around the potential risks and conflicts. And I guess the seemingly simple term that we all throw around, which is collective land rights. And on that note, I'd like to turn to Siabo to kick off the discussion around what this is looking like at national levels. I think, Siabo, if you could tell us about what's happening in South Africa, some of the challenges that you're facing relating to sort of growing interest around collective land, and also the challenges with what it means to have collective land. So over to you, Siabo.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Johanna, for the presentation. The South African context in a few minutes is a fairly complex one. Firstly, we're dealing with the transition from the colonial apartheid era to the democratic dispensation, faced with pressures to make change in people's lives. One of the most important and most ambitious social engineering programs being land reform in this case of South Africa. The lens I would like to use in looking at this is land rights, because one of the legs of key elements of land reform in South Africa is land tenure reform, which deals with rights. During the transition process, the new government and the constitution firstly recognized customary rights, and that was entrenched in the constitution. And that being entrenched in the constitution was followed up by the piece of an interim piece of legislation, which was put in place as a holding mechanism, while a more comprehensive piece of legislation would be developed at a later stage. Without getting into detail, 30 years down the line, we're still sitting with that piece of legislation, which was intended to be interim. And what does this actually translate to? Over the 30-year period, we've recently done some work with Align, between Landness and Align, looking at what the impact, what this piece of legislation translates to in reality, in practice for people's rights. Without even going into a lot of detail, there's a lot of disjuncture between what the policy purports or seeks to do, the amount of space that the Constitution provides is not taken up in its full extent in terms of the legislation that is in place. And further, in practice, practitioners or government officials who are implementing the legislation tend to implement things at a standard that is even less than that which is legislated. People tend to fall back to old practices where rights and customary rights in particular were not recognized. I think for the South African case, with the growth in demand and growth for mining resources, mineral resources, this is becoming increasingly a big issue. This whole disjuncture between policy and practice. And just a few examples as a way of wrapping it up. Customary rights in South Africa involve anywhere between at least 16 and 21 million people in a like 56 million people country. So we're talking about a significant population. Some of the disjunctures we're seeing is where the state cannot distinguish between consultation and consent, and who should be consulted and who should give the consent. So while the law or policy at a constitutional level may sound quite good, at the level of implementation, issues get watered down, and the very rights which were intended to be protected tend to be undermined. I think that's just the short of it, the disjuncture between policy objectives on the one hand and policy, or that is law, that is pegged lower than what the Constitution provides for, plus practice that is pegged even lower. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Siabo, and your incredibly rich reflections. And I'm hoping we'll be able to dig into some of the tensions that that disconnect creates. And I think, to perhaps reflect that it's not that unusual, I'd like to turn to Imam, who is joining us from Indonesia today. Imam, would you be able to tell us about what's happening in Indonesia in terms of collective lands and the global transition to low carbon approaches?
Baik, terima kasih. Salam semuanya dari Indonesia. Terkait dengan topik yang sedang kita bicarakan, memang ada banyak persoalan ya, khususnya terkait dengan tanah adat di Indonesia, bahwa konstitusi Indonesia mengakui tentang keberadaan masyarakat adat dan beserta hak-hak tradisionalnya sepanjang masih ada. Namun kemudian situasi ini tidak ditindaklanjuti dengan adanya kementerian atau lembaga yang secara penuh bertanggung jawab sebagai wali data. Wali data adalah pihak yang kemudian mengidentifikasi, memverifikasi, dan juga menunjukkan semua data yang terkait dengan masyarakat adat. Sehingga dalam konteks Indonesia praktis baru tahun 2024 tanah adat itu sudah ada kebijakan yang memperbolehkan untuk proses registrasi. Nah, dengan tidak ajalnya registrasi dalam kurun waktu yang lama itu menyebabkan banyak tanah yang kemudian tidak terdaftar atau tidak bersertifikat atau yang kemudian dianggap tidak bertuan. Nah, ini juga kemudian diperparah dengan klaim kawasan hutan. Kalau di Indonesia terbagi menjadi 3 dalam konteks ruang masyarakat. Ada kawasan hutan, ada areal penggunaan lain, dan ada wilayah perairan dan pantai. Nah, karena lemahnya yang terkait dengan data, ketersediaan data masyarakat, ini yang kemudian banyak kebijakan pembangunan yang kemudian bertumpang tindih di wilayah masyarakat, baik adat ataupun lokal. Dalam konteks masa lalu kita memiliki kawasan hutan yang mengklaim kurang lebih JKPP sudah melakukan pemetaan kurang lebih 26 juta hektar dan 20 juta hektar bagiannya itu bertumpang tindih dengan wilayah adat dengan kawasan hutan dan 5.000 hektar itu kurang lebih bertumpang tindih dengan perizinan dan konsesi. Nah, dari sini kemudian diperparah lagi dengan banyaknya isu yang baru atau program baru atau proyek baru, entah untuk infrastruktur atau atas nama lingkungan, termasuk juga dengan transisi berkeadilan, di mana kemudian energi terbarukan menjadi isu. Kalau di Indonesia ada konteks tambang nikel, yang itu juga kemudian mengorbankan keberadaan masyarakat setempat. Yang artinya bahwa ada situasi yang ketika isu lama belum selesai, dia diperparah konflik tumpang tindih dan penyerobatan ruangnya dengan isu-isu yang baru, baik isu lingkungan ataupun isu transisi berkeadilan. Sehingga ya tidak jarang ini menjadi pertanyaan yang mendasar buat kita bahwa satu hal yang kita impikan merupakan sebuah keadilan, itu harusnya kita mulai dari sesuatu yang adil lebih dulu. Paling tidak dalam konteks pemanfaatan ruang dan lahan, ada proses pengamanan, perlindungan, dan kepastian hak bagi masyarakat setempat, baik masyarakat adat maupun masyarakat lokal. Saya pikir begitu dalam konteks Indonesia, jadi memang secara kebijakan dan fakta, itu memang ada tumpang tindih ruang antar sektor, khususnya yang terkait dengan masyarakat adat dan masyarakat lokal. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Imam, for those very concise and precise insights. And I think, flagging that issue around data and how the absence of it sort of can also erase visibility of the people and communities who are being impacted. I think linked to that, I'm very keen to move to Jimmy, who's been waiting patiently, and hear about the Ugandan experience. And Jimmy, if you don't mind, it would be great if you could tell us about what the energy transition looks like in Uganda, particularly, from the perspective of collective lands.
Thank
Over
you
to
very
you,
much,
Jimmy.
Jacobs. Yes, thank you very much, Jacobs. What my colleagues have discussed is not any different from what is happening in Uganda. It's only that in Uganda, we are still lagging behind. So just transition or energy transition is something that is a little bit challenging because as so many things have been introduced, we are discovering oil. We are trying to work on our agribusiness projects. We're trying to improve our infrastructure through our infrastructure projects. And then here comes a conversation on energy transition. It's a little bit of a confusing moment for a country like Uganda, which is still developing. So, of course, this will not be something, is not something that is welcomed fully by our government because we have just discovered oil, we have just discovered a lot of mineral deposits, and so we would really want to utilize these to exacerbate our development. But for the projects that are running in the country, they have been really affected by the fact that in Uganda, collective land ownership or collective ownership of land is really the biggest form of ownership of land. While we have 4 kinds of tenure systems in Uganda, we only have one which is a major. It's about 75% of land is owned communally. So if you introduce projects like infrastructure projects, agricultural projects, and then you bring in the issue of energy transition, of course, the people who own land communally are going to be the most affected because most of the land that is owned communally or collectively has no title. It is verbally owned, and so when the compensations come in from the different projects, allocating individual benefits is a very big problem. And of course, there are also lands that are managed by cultural leaders who have very high uphandedness on how land is managed, and so people within those collective lands are most likely not going to enjoy any compensations that come out of that. Yeah, so it becomes a very challenging issue. Then most of the land is not titled. Most of the land, actually 75% of the land in Uganda is based on oral history. Yeah, and community recognition, which can lead to disputes because everyone knows their land according to what they had their parents say that this is my land. And so infrastructural projects are really affecting these communities. Yeah, so we have community collective land ownership is actually recognized in Uganda through our Land Act in what we call the communal land associations. So Uganda, through its laws, allows people to commune and own a piece of land. Probably can all the rights are collective in nature, but it is not a very common thing currently because of the competitions that are coming in with these new projects, and everyone wants to enjoy the benefits that come with compensations, the benefits that come with so many things around that. So it's happening, but it's not really something that people are doing, but it's something that we are working on as a country to harmonize that. Now, some of the challenges I've already mentioned above, lack of formal documentation, like people own land in the east and the south and the west and the central part of Uganda, but no one has a title. Yeah, so it's a risky business, and these agribusiness and large-scale investments are really affecting the communities, especially those in collective setups. Pressure from investors and government projects. As I told you earlier on, government is trying to move to, they call it middle income status, but the only thing that they have available is land, minerals, oil. We have a lot of oil. So government is also trying to work on projects. So the pressure from the investors, and of course, Uganda being almost 95% of the land arable, attracts so many conglomerations and agreements from different countries that want to utilize the diversity or the fertility of the land to produce certain things. So those are all pressures that government is facing. And then we have something with limited awareness and a capacity to form and manage some of these communal land associations, because the criteria, the legal procedures are quite hectic, and we know that the people who own this land are lay people, and then the process needs a legal mind to follow up, but also needs resources. So eventually people do not cluster themselves into communal land associations, so they decide to own land verbally and orally. Yeah, so Nathan, I would like to say that's what I can say for now, and I would like to get back to you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, and thank you so much, Jimmy. I think you've sort of laid a really solid foundation for the next round of questions, and I think also highlighted some of those thorny issues around, who and how are benefits allocated, what is the sort of position of cultural leaders, and how do the communities engage in the decision-making process. And I think hopefully we can touch on these issues as we move into our second round of questions, which is really focused on how some of these challenges are being addressed. And in sort of that spirit, I'd like to move to Vilmeen and ask you, Vilmeen, if you can share some of the strategies and approaches that are taking place in South Africa.
Thank you, Nathania. Yeah, and it is interesting to hear how similar the issues are that we're all dealing with. So, on the issue of who gets to consent, and so here for us, it's very much about making visible the members of communities, because I think what happens here in South Africa, and it seems like in many other countries, there's kind of there's this fallback on what is, in South Africa at least, the colonial notion of the community being kind of invisible and you only see the leader. And so the leader say-so becomes the say-so of the community. And so we've used litigation very much to try and make visible the members of the community. And of course, one of the important mechanisms would be if those rights of the members of the community can be recorded properly. So we've had this ironic situation in South Africa where some of our communal landholding communities, in particular those that were able to claim back land that they were dispossessed of under apartheid, they were granted title deeds as communities, but that's actually made them more insecure than more secure, because the title deed is at the level of the community. So, whoever is in charge, the traditional leader, for example, then has an enormous amount of power over the title, and the members' rights are invisible. And so we've used litigation as much as we can to give content to the rights of community members using customary law, and kind of trying to unshackle customary law from these colonial notions, and to say, well, that's actually, the rights of households and lower level clans and so on are far stronger under customary law. But then also we've relied very much on this notion of substantive equality, so which is one in the South African Constitution, and I think equality is such a most of our constitutions rely on that. But so we've used that notion to say that communities who have historically been disadvantaged through not having security of tenure, that they deserve to be treated better than people with secure tenure, so titled owners. And so on that basis, we've actually been able to get the courts to confirm that customary owners have stronger rights when it comes to extractives in South Africa than common law owners, so title deed holders. So consent is at the moment only a right of customary communities. Now, litigation is one thing, and we have good judgments. But so we're now trying in our other strategies to work with the state to try and help find ways of getting officials to understand these very nuanced issues around consent and around inquiries into the customary law of the community and into the rights of the members of the community, and to make sure the right people are consenting. And yeah, finally, we have a very permissive law in South Africa around public participation in law reform. And so that is something that we participate in to a large extent, and also try and get the voices of communities before or in front of Parliament when they make laws. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Philomene. And I think, what's being said is definitely resonating with our audience. I'm seeing chats sort of picking up these issues around the disconnect, around sort of how some areas of the law are moving forward and others are lagging behind. And I'm really keen to hear from Imam on what his take is in the Indonesian context and how things are progressing and the strategies being used to put people on the map and address these issues. So over to you, Imam.
Baik, terima kasih. Kami menyadari bahwa ada kesenjangan besar yang terkait dengan data yang menjadi rujukan bagi pemerintah dalam pengambilan keputusan. Sehingga sejak tahun 90-an kami sudah mencoba bekerja bersama masyarakat untuk melakukan proses yang namanya pemetaan partisipatif. Dan data-data ini adalah data informasi yang terkait hubungan antara masyarakat secara sosial dengan ruang dan lahannya. Nah, dalam konteks Indonesia, kesejarahan atas ruang itu mendapat pengakuan oleh pemerintah. Dan kemudian penguasaan selama lebih dari 20 tahun itu sudah bisa menjadi hak milik. Namun, sekali lagi kita kekurangan data yang terkait dengan data komunitas, sehingga yang menjadi strategi bagi kami di sini adalah melakukan proses pemetaan partisipatif untuk seluruh ruang hidup masyarakat, baik adat, lokal, termasuk juga masyarakat yang ada di pesisir. Nah, dengan demikian kami juga melakukan proses advokasi dan komunikasi kepada pemerintah, mendorong agar data-data masyarakat yang terhimpun di dalam peta partisipatif itu bisa masuk menjadi salah satu bagian dalam kebijakan satu peta, di mana kami berharap bahwa data masyarakat ini menjadi salah satu layer dalam proses sinkronisasi antar kementerian, sinkronisasi antar pihak untuk melihat di mana saja konflik itu terjadi dan strategi apa yang perlu dilakukan dalam rangka proses penyelesaian konflik ruang dan lahan. Sehingga dengan demikian ada situasi yang clear and clean ketika perubahan akan dilakukan, dan saya pikir partisipasi terpenting masyarakat dalam konteks ini adalah bagaimana masyarakat berpartisipasi yang dimulai dari data. Kita menyamakan satu rujukan data yang sama, yaitu data yang terverifikasi, data yang tersinkronisasi antar pihak, sehingga kedepannya tidak ada konflik dan tidak ada komplain, khususnya yang berasal dari masyarakat. Dan ini juga bagian dari upaya kami untuk mendorong proses keadilan sosial agar apa yang terkait dengan ruang dan lahan serta sumber daya alam itu bisa menjadi perhatian yang lebih, khususnya bagi para pengambil kebijakan di tingkat nasional. Menurut saya begitu. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Imam. And yes, I think, this issue of information and ensuring everyone has access to information and the necessary data to make informed decisions has come up so strongly across the webinar, but also I think in everyone's collective work. I think also there's been really interesting issues raised around the disconnect in the law, the tension between government priorities. Jim was mentioning, oil versus sort of this conversation that we're having around sort of green solutions. And I'm quite keen to hear, Jimmy, what your take on sort of what the solutions are, how we can address some of these challenges, and how Oxfam is supporting the efforts in Uganda. So over to you, Jimmy.
All right. So despite the confusion that Uganda is facing, Uganda has taken a number of strides to balance these two competitions. And currently, Uganda is developing a national just transition framework. It is something that government has put a lot of emphasis on. This is led by the National Planning Authority, of course, with support from the Climate Investment Fund, African Development Bank, and other development partners that are supporting in other ways. And the framework aims to ensure sustainable development efforts are inclusive and equitable. Of course, having it in mind that there are these other development competitions that our country is suffering from. But of course, Oxfam with partners, as I said, Oxfam, as you all know, Oxfam works through partners, and we provide platforms and conversations around such difficult and sensitive topics. We have developed some key approaches through our different projects that we work on in Uganda. And one of our key approaches that we have looked out is to have stakeholder engagement to try and understand the keenness the government is trying to make towards development, but also looking at the climate and the just energy transition that is also happening in the country and how this can be managed together. So broad consultations with government, society, and community groups is being done right now, and we've developed what we call a just transition technical working group. This Oxfam and other technical people are part of. And then we have developed what we call a principle-based planning. That's why, as I mentioned above, we are currently decided that this is a planning issue. So we're working with the National Planning Authority to make sure that we work on this, ensuring that no group disproportionately bears the cost of transitions. The cost of transitions are quite high, so we are trying to see that no group disproportionately bears the cost of transitions. So we are putting measures or principles to follow when transitions are happening, especially in the areas that we've been talking about. And then promoting social welfare safeguards for vulnerable populations. As I mentioned above, 85% of the land is customarily owned, but also the vulnerable people are on that land. So we are trying to come up with frameworks that support social welfare safeguards for these vulnerable populations, so that in case there's a transition happening, their lives are in a better state. And I know my colleague has already talked about FPIC. Something of that sort is what we're trying to work on in Uganda. And then there's something we call sexual integration, where we embed just transition principles into energy, agriculture, transport, and urban planning, because we know this is an integrated thing. Energy, agriculture. Uganda is an agricultural country, but also wants to move towards infrastructure development. So it's a little bit of a mix. So embedding these principles into all these competing priorities, something that is key that Oxfam is working on with partners to do, and then encouraging sustainable land use. We know that even when we are blessed with a very good climate in Uganda, we still suffer from poor land use, and poor land use is currently increasing on changing weather patterns in Uganda. And you know that Uganda it depends on the rain, the wet season, the dry season. So people just use the seasons to do cultivation. It's something that we need to support, or we are trying to support farmers in Uganda to outcome. Then lastly, we are doing a lot of training of local institutions. We know that local institutions in communities are the backbone of dealing with the implications of just transition. And we understand, and we have tried to support these to participate in these transition processes, and also helping them understand the transition principles and what their rights are when the transition principles are being implemented. So majorly, that's what I can say for now. Thank you very much, Nathania. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, and thanks for those insights, Jimmy. And I think I see we have participants sort of adding in those issues around raising awareness, and also understanding the true impacts of land management operations. And also I see Johanna's adding helpful comments around those tensions we see in laws and the conflicts. I'm aware that we're running slightly behind schedule as we move into our third round of questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists to keep their answers quite tight so that we make sure we have enough time for questions and answers with the audience. But I think, moving on to that final set of questions, what advice, and this question goes to Vilmeen, what advice do we have for decision makers and those working on the just transition in South Africa, and what do they need to keep in mind when we have collective land rights at stake?
So I would say again, what they need to bear in mind is that communities are not single monolithic things, and that they can assume that speaking to one means speaking to the whole community. And someone also on the chat mentioned fisherfolk, and a case in point, we a couple of years ago we had both on the east coast and the west coast of South Africa, Shell and others vying for oil and gas exploration permits. They got the permits based on consultations with leaders, and we represented fishers on both coasts that went to court and said, well, you made the mistake of thinking that speaking to the leader means you're speaking also to, for example, the fishers, which is it's a community within a bigger community. And in both cases, we were successful, because you can't understand the impact of what you're trying to do if you don't speak to people who can tell you how extraction will impact. And for sure, no oil company will try and get a permit in South Africa again without speaking to, for example, the small scale fishers. So to me, understanding that communities are complex things, and if you want to dispossess them of their land rights, then the onus is on you to figure out who to speak to.
Fantastic. Thank you for those insights, which certainly resonate incredibly strongly. This is a reminder for those in the audience to please add their questions to the chat so that we can get to them and hopefully cover them in the next couple of minutes. And now I'm going to hand over to Siabo for your take on that question of what people should be considering when we talk about just transition and collective land rights.
Thank you. This is such a huge topic that I just need to closest to my heart. One of the issues themes that have come through from the start of this presentation is data, the importance of data, and the fact that you do not have data in customary systems because people keep data verbally. It is possible in today's world where any form of data, voice, visual, can be accommodated into our data systems. Now, the biggest challenge that our governments have to deal with is to open up space for for recognition of different kinds of rights, which do not necessarily match the Western grid type, where one plot belongs to one person. In the African context specifically, the issue is people belong to the land more than the land belongs to them. Now, our recordal systems don't have space for that idea. And the second issue I would like to raise with regard to data is if data is correct and recorded correctly, that is the easiest step. The worst thing is how to maintain it going forward from one generation to the next generation. So if we think carefully about these two big issues around data, we can make quite a bit of policy advance, because for as long as you do not have this data, who do you consult? Who are you expecting consent from? All those issues become murky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siabo, for that. And I think you put it really nicely in terms of, how people keep the data verbally, and that data is in many different forms. And I'd like to turn to Imam for his views on what needs to be taken into account within the Indonesian context. So over to you, Imam.
Iya, mudah-mudahan translatornya jalan ya, karena tadi ada yang komen translatornya masih bermasalah. Yang pertama, partisipasi yang penuh itu menjadi penting dari masyarakat yang harus dipertimbangkan oleh pemerintah. Jadi bukan hanya partisipasi yang mengundang elit atau mengundang orang-orang di kalangan terbatas gitu ya. Karena partisipasi sebenarnya adalah langsung bertemu dengan semua orang yang ada di tingkat lokal, di tingkat kampung. Yang kedua, partisipasi kedua ya, yang paling penting tadi sudah saya sebutkan bahwa data itu penting untuk menggunakan data yang real yang berasal dari masyarakat, bukan sekedar data formal yang dibuat oleh konsultan ataupun oleh pemerintah yang kadang-kadang tidak mewakili situasi yang ada di tingkat masyarakat. Nah, sehingga saya pikir transisi energi itu perlu mempertimbangkan hak masyarakat, perlu mempertimbangkan keadilan masyarakat setempat, tidak sekedar mengejar target iklim atau sekedar membangun proyek yang terkadang malah menggusur dan menambah permasalahan konflik ruang yang ada di masyarakat. Ini saya hanya bicara dalam konteks Indonesia karena jujur saya tidak mengerti dan tidak paham dengan situasi yang ada di luar, termasuk saya sangat percaya bahwa kita memiliki kebijakan politik yang berbeda, kebijakan yang berbeda, kultur yang berbeda, serta sejarah yang juga berbeda, termasuk pilihan strategi yang akan. Namun sekali lagi pelibatan dari sejak awal, persetujuan masyarakat termasuk data yang kemudian diakomodir sebagai data ofisial itu penting untuk menunjukkan bahwa tidak ada ruang, karena bicara transisi energi pada akhirnya kalau di Indonesia itu akan bicara ya mungkin listrik, mungkin juga baterai yang itu akan berasal dari nikel pertambangan yang akan menghabiskan banyak lahan masyarakat, atau misalnya pusat listrik tenaga surya yang mempunyai atau restorasi ekosistem yang juga kadang-kadang membatasi akses masyarakat ke dalam sumber daya alam, baik hutan dan lain-lain. Mungkin itu saja dari saya. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much, Imam. And yes, I think, what you highlight around the reality check of making sure that what we're talking about actually resonates with those on the ground cannot be overstated. I am now going to hand over to Jimmy to hear what your takes are around how we can pragmatically deal with some of these issues. You have the last word. I know we're running over time, so I ask you to please keep it tight.
Right.
But over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think some of the things that our government should keep in mind, that following the human rights-based approaches, we know that a just transition must not exacerbate existing inequalities or lead to human rights violation. So we can encourage this through adopting things like the payment ecosystem services, where we encourage people to do things like growing trees and pay them for that, but also finding ways to support people, protect their environments, but also giving them chance to benefit from that. And then communities, especially those under customary tenure, must be protected from forced evictions and displacement and loss of livelihoods. We know that government is interested in putting us at a level of the middle income status, but I think this should be something that they look out for. Customary and collective land rights must be formally recognized and protected under national law. I do not want to say that if customary land is given title, then it is safe enough, because I've already seen a question around there. But I feel there must be a form or a way we recognize these rights. It may not necessarily be a title, but there must be a form that gives the people that own that land some bit of ownership. And mechanisms like communal land associations should be strengthened by to give communities legal standing. I think people who own land communally should be recognized, and that should be adapted in Uganda. I know that the indigenous people in other countries are familiar with this kind of ownership. Communities must be consulted meaningfully before any land-related decisions are made, and I think this is something that government of Uganda is looking at. And the FPIC principles already been explained. FPIC is essential to uphold participation and agency, especially in resource extraction and infrastructure projects. And then, of course, where land acquisition is unavoidable, fair compensation and resettlement plans have to be put in place so that the people affected do not suffer what happens after. Compensation should reflect market value and cultural significance and future livelihood potential. I think this is explained in the FPIC principles. And then gender and social inclusion. Women, youth, and marginalized groups must have equal rights and representation in land governance. And this is something that we have been talking a lot about. Land reforms should address gender disparities in ownership and decision making. And then lastly, projects must assess and mitigate environmental impacts and protect ecosystem services tied to communal land. And then support for alternative livelihoods and skills development is crucial for communities affected by transitions. So thank you very much. Over to you, Jacobs.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, for ending us off with such a solid set of recommendations. And I think it captures many of the elements that have come up throughout the discussion. I'd like to thank all our speakers for the fantastic conversation. I think there's a wealth of knowledge, and I wish we had more time so that we could really get into the nitty-gritties. But I do see that there's been a lot of questions from the audience, and it's so wonderful to have that level of engagement. And I'd like to get to some of those questions. I'd also really love to bring Johanna back into the conversation. I see a lot of engagement around what she's presented. And I think the first question is for you, Johanna. It's from Esther Filippini, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. It's given current political context in many countries, example in the US, are there any hopeful signs or opportunities to recognize Indigenous land rights and the hidden costs of the energy transition? And it's asking if you, Johanna, can give some hopeful or inspiring information around ongoing efforts.
Sure, thank you. So for me, the hopeful signs are that we see a growing recognition about this particular issue. So I think I mentioned, and maybe I was rushing in the end, but there are a number of new initiatives that have emerged. So you have a special like a report by the Secretary General on this particular issue. You have some things coming out of the Office for the High Commission of Human Rights. There were a number of summits that raised awareness of it. And especially, I was quite surprised to see that at the World Bank Land Conference, an indigenous woman, some of you may know, Hindu Omaro Ibrahim, who's a very well-known indigenous advocate, she opened the forum, raising awareness of precisely this particular issue. So I think there is a growing awareness. So that's positive. You also see even in, and I'm not saying this is the way forward, but some of the difficult conversations happening on indigenous co-owned mines, like in Canada, particularly in Canada and Australia, there are examples where I would imagine in countries where you have probably the rights better protected and larger areas of land being managed by indigenous peoples, where they are willing to engage in a conversation. In Greenland as well, which is politically, of course, a very complicated space right now. You have conversations on this, and you have actually some of these initiatives moving forward, recognizing that somewhere these minerals, have to be generated. A lot of us use computers, and they have to come from somewhere. But obviously, what we all want to see is that the rights are respected. My concern is the push, the massive push that we see, and also that unlike in other, like with oil and coal, where you had an alignment with the environmental movement, which was fighting side by side with indigenous peoples and others who were affected by this. This is a little different now because the push towards the energy transition is also, there's so much movement behind that. So I think that alignment is really, really critical. And I would love to hear actually maybe also, if not now, but another time in South Africa, because there was the decolonize movement. How are they engaging in this issue? Because that I would imagine is one of those conversations where you have to align potentially conflicting positions on some of this. So I think that's what I can say right now. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks so much, Johanna. I think it's incredibly helpful. And I would invite South African colleagues to come in on that point, sort of as we're answering the next questions. And I think I'd like to jump to, there's a question around the impact on women, and it's women often experience climate impacts differently through the loss of water, fuel, fodder, or caregiving responsibilities. How can collective land governance explicitly account for these differentiated burdens while ensuring women also share equally in the opportunities that climate action may bring? And I wondered, Jimmy, maybe you can jump in on this question, given that you had mentioned issues around gender, and then potentially we can get some views from across the panel. But Jimmy, are you happy to take this question?
Yes. Yeah, so I think for Uganda, particularly, we are very keen to gender and women as an issue of its own, and we have put aside a number of policies and frameworks that support gender inclusion. And if you looked at my presentation earlier on, when I was talking about the just transition framework, it's very inclusive and puts that in mind, because we know that when the transitions are happening, the women and youth are most affected. So we have put this in place, but also the working groups that we have designed help government as they design their interventions to put this in mind. And of course, the frameworks that we have supported them with also support them in coming up with such frameworks that are really gender sensitive. So this issue on my side is something that governments are really aware about, especially that most of the land in Uganda is collectively owned or communally owned. So this is something that really requires a lot of engagement from organizations like Oxfam. Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And I think it's raising some really important issues around those impacts and how they can be accounted for. And I think it also starts to touch a bit on those issues that Siabo was flagging about getting below the surface and understanding what sort of the different interests within communities are. And that was very strongly reiterated by Vilmeen. I see we also have a question here about it. Well, it's basically from a perspective in Suriname, and it says that tenure land rights are not recognized yet. How can NGOs prepare tribal and indigenous communities for these? And I guess it's quite a wide question, and I'd be interested to hear from Imam around his thoughts on the recognition of land tenure rights and work with communities. But then I'd also be quite curious to hear from the South Africa perspective. So, Imam, maybe you can take a first stab at this question.
Baik, terima kasih. Kalau dalam konteks Indonesia, yang pertama kita akan mendorong pengakuan untuk subjek, karena masyarakat harus ditetapkan dulu sebagai masyarakat adat. Setelah itu baru kita bicara tentang hutan adat, tanah komunal atau tanah ulayat, atau laut adat gitu. Nah, biasanya dalam konteks Indonesia kita ada beberapa skema dari kebijakan yang kita pakai untuk memastikan wilayah kelola masyarakat. Untuk di kawasan hutan kita biasanya mendorong untuk hutan adat, itu adalah bentuk pengakuan formal dari pemerintah, meskipun ya secara politik masih bukan bentuk pengembalian hak yang penuh kepada masyarakat, tapi untuk sementara bolehlah dipakai. Di areal penggunaan lain di luar kawasan hutan, kita baru saja memulai di tahun 2024 ini, karena sebelumnya memang kebijakan belum ada, itu identifikasi untuk tanah komunal. Tanah komunal ini adalah tanah ulayat yang secara turun-temurun dimiliki, dikuasai oleh masyarakat adat. Termasuk juga saat ini kita sedang dekat atau bekerja sama dengan Kementerian Perikanan untuk melakukan proses identifikasi wilayah masyarakat adat di wilayah pesisir. Nah, strategi kami memang strategi advokasi yang perlawanannya lebih kepada perlawanan yang soft, pendekatan kepada pemerintah melalui kebijakan formal. Namun begitu, kami juga terlibat untuk mendorong kebijakan yang memang belum ada, yang itu diperlukan bagi masyarakat, baik secara lembaga ataupun dengan jaringan yang lain seperti Undang-Undang Masyarakat Adat. Mendorong adanya wali data masyarakat adat hari ini di Indonesia itu menjadi hal krusial, karena tanpa wali data maka peta partisipatif yang sudah dibuat oleh masyarakat adat itu tidak akan pernah terintegrasi ke dalam kebijakan satu peta, sehingga dengan demikian dia tidak mungkin tersinkronisasi dengan semua kementerian, yang artinya masih akan ada banyak konflik lahan dan ruang yang terjadi jika ini tidak dilakukan. Namun pendekatan lain kami juga mencoba untuk membantu dan bekerja sama dengan pemerintah daerah. Ini adalah melalui proses integrasi peta partisipatif sebagai salah satu dasar data untuk perencanaan tata ruang wilayah kabupaten. Yang harapannya ini akan mensinkronisasi antara kepentingan pemerintah dengan kepentingan masyarakat. Walaupun secara politik berat, karena di Indonesia untuk tata ruang itu masih sifatnya masih top down. Jadi nasional menentukan, baru turun ke provinsi, baru turun ke kabupaten. Namun demikian kita harus mencoba untuk sesuatu yang lebih baik, mencoba bottom up dengan cara memulai dengan mengkoleksi data dan mendorong data itu kepada pemerintah daerah ataupun kepada kementerian yang ada. Sehingga ya harapannya sinkronisasi data akan memungkinkan berkurangnya konflik yang ada di Indonesia. Saya pikir begitu.
Thank you so much for those insights, Imam. And I'd like to move to, there's a great question here, which asks whether we think formal title protects collective land rights of indigenous peoples, and are African governments and officials in the government ready to enforce those rights? I'd love to put that question to Vilmien to get your views of whether you think that, or what you think that situation in South Africa is.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak from the South African experience and to say that formal title, where it's been granted to communities holding land communally, it has had the opposite effect. It is certainly not created tenure security, in particular for the members of those communities, because they become completely invisible when there's title, just level of community. So that certainly does not seem to be a solution in the South African context. And part of that is also because our property law has very little nuance. So there are, and I think it might well be possible to find spaces in our various legal systems to indeed record and title these kinds of communal rights in a way that does provide tenure security, but it certainly hasn't been the case for us. And so what that means is that what we really try and do is find ways of recording rights at a lower level, at the household level, etc., but not through titling. Also because again, in our context, titling creates a form of private ownership that is in many instances directly kind of antithetical to how people hold and obtain rights within customary communities as members of that community, and therefore, for example, being able to sell it out and so on would be antithetical to that. So it's a very tough nut to crack, but and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like titling is a simple solution to the problem.
Thanks for that, Vilmien. And yeah, I think we'd need a couple of webinars to fully discuss and unpack that issue around titling. And I think it raises some really important questions when we start talking about the just transition. I'd like to put and perhaps take a chance and combine two questions into one for Siabo. I'm quite keen to have your views, Siabo, on this question around collective land rights clashing with state or corporate interests in renewable energy conservation or carbon markets, and how should movements and policymakers navigate those trade-offs? Can there be a just transition without addressing land grabs in the context of green development? So that's the first question. And perhaps being a little cheeky, I'd also like to hear your views on that question around participation and whether governments consult and should consult vulnerable populations when developing land policies and laws. So over to you, Siabo, if you're happy to take those questions. Do we still have Siabo?
He's on mute.
Would you be able to unmute?
Oh,
Siabo?
apologies about that. Starting with the easier one is consultation and getting consent from actual land rights holders is unquestionable. I want to put into a whole lot of debate about that. And going to the more complex one, we have been talking about data here. And the issue we're dealing with respect to land rights holders, you've got customary layered rights, rights of the individual, rights of which are spread within a household, rights that are spread and within a neighborhood and the wider community. And these, in Western systems, are embedded in one way or other. You are not allowed, as a result of current systems, to build a double-storied building when it's not in sync with the rest of your neighborhood. The same principle applies in customary systems. For customary systems are layered, and when you record them, you need to record them as such and not necessarily fit them into Western notions of people-land relationship. That's the first one. That deals with the interests of the land rights holders. Governments are under serious pressure in developing countries. They promise development and mining adverse or whatever adversities it's likely to bring. Governments want economic development. This is an ever existing tension. That's all. The only can deal with that is people vigilance, community participation. If people bottom-up processes are the space for those, then governments cannot do as they wish. Business interests have got their own tools and interests. In the South African context, we're now currently sitting in a complex situation where the interests between business, which you don't know whether it's actually business or you can term of it as crooks, labeled as business, both national and international. These are some of these are contradictions that have to be managed. And the only way to manage those is to ensure that communities' voices can be heard. And the way we need to record rights should not mimic anything we currently have. We should accommodate rights recordal systems for customary communities in a totally different manner, in the manner in which it exists, and not turn it into the same form that Western systems do recordal for. Thank you. That's my quick take of a complex question. Thank you.
And thank you so much for doing justice to such a complex question in such a succinct way. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I see there's been some fantastic engagements in the chats, and I'd like to say once again a very thanks to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for joining us here today. We really appreciate your participation and engagement. And if we couldn't get to your questions, we apologize. And lastly, please don't forget to take the survey. We'd like to know what you thought of the webinar, how we can improve, and what we could discuss next. So again, thank you to everyone for being here. And hopefully we can continue the conversation in other fora. Goodbye.
Bye.